Right. NextJS has a lot of changes since its introduction of the app folder. There are a lot of concepts that we need to know in order to understand exactly how it behaves and why sometimes our application doesn't go as expected. But today I don't want to touch so many different things all at once, because I think then there will be a very very long video and very untargeted. So I'm just going to focus on the environment variables and just solely discuss about how Next.js 13 can handle the environment files, so that we can inject a runtime configuration or build time configuration into our Next.js applications. Right. Without further ado, let's get started. Firstly, there are two ways of injecting environment variables. The first way is you have this .env file that lists down, for example, a list of environments that you want your server to have. So this is the latest way. Secondly, you can use the next.config.js file, where inside the next.config.js you specify the two configs. One is a server runtime config, another type is a public runtime config. Then with these two configuration, you then can access it by using the getConfig function. Right, so these are the two ways, and the only two ways that is allowed for Next.js. And I will not discuss about any third-party libraries because Next.js already have its way of handling the configurations. So very likely you will not want to install external dependencies to handle the environment for you, because that may break the the build tool that Next.js has already provided. Okay, so the difference between the two ways, let's explore by looking at some examples. Well, the latest way of writing this is actually very straightforward. You just create a .env file and then specify your environments, okay, your variables. So the first example is next public env var. So this environment is started with the next public prefix. Whatever environment variable that starts with this prefix will be available in both client and also the server side. So usually, if we want the client components to access certain environment, then we will add the prefix in. But on another word, we do not want to put sensitive information with this prefix. It is very important because in a client component, it means that your entire JavaScript bundle will be sent over to the UI, to the browser, and the browser will have access to read whatever variables that you have put in, including this next public env var. So you do not want to put in sensitive information like your access key, your secrets and all this into next public variable. If you really want to say make your Next.js app dynamic with the secret keys, then you use the one without next public. So the ones that is without next public, it is not visible to the client side because it's also not accessible in the browser. Because what Next.js do is that it will render the component first together with every pre-processing that you want, and then after the component has been ready to serve, then it will return the component to our client side. So every computation that is using the sensitive secrets will be handled in the server side. So Next.js also has its server, okay, in its server side, and then only pass over to the client side. The downside with the variable without next prefix, the next public prefix, is that it's not accessible in the browser. It is very important to recognize the difference because it will impact how you want to write the code. Okay, so now we have the .env and also the envar. Well, in the legacy way or in the old way, if we want to access the environment like this, well, we can use this thing called get server side props in the. So this is the old way. Like if you don't want to use the app folder, you use the pages folder, then you can write like this, and then using the get server side props to call any functions or any operations in your server, your NextJS server, before it renders. And then see that if you want to directly pass in the environment, also can. Then after you prepare all this data from the server, and then depends on what you want to do here. You probably don't want to pass in the secret to the client, right? And then your component or your current page will then use the props that's passed from the server to do the display or any UI changes or any operations. Right. So this is the old way. How about the new way? Right. If you look at the app folder, inside that there's a page.tsx referring to our root URL. We can see that there are my current structure is very simple. I just have the process.env, so I can console log the next public environment variable and also the normal environment variable. Inside the component, we also have this process.env.next public env in our hash1. Okay, so the intended behavior here is that it will console log. So remember, we have this console.log, right? The two variables, but we actually don't see any logs in our console log. Why? Because the component by default, like in NextJS 13, is server-side rendered. So you see the logs actually coming out in A, B, C, D, F right here. Right, my cursor here. All the thing before is just now I do testing, come out with this. But just refer to the two last rows, A, B, C, D, F. Well, if we put the variable or the console log inside the component? Let's have a look. Right. As expected, we don't see any log either. So meaning that the console.log, it will not be shown in the client side if your component is a server component. Alright. So next, let's try to also access the envar from our component and see if we can display anything. Right. As you can see, we can. So a server component by default can access to the public environment variable, but remember that if we inspect the HTML, it's essentially just a text that's returned to the client side. So it doesn't introduce the security concerns for our secrets variables. Alright, so this is the first example. Next, let's import a client component and have a look at the difference there. So a client component in NextJS 13 starts with a use client call this like a tag at the top to tell the NextJS that, oh, this component is a client-side component. And this client-side component, I just want to say, just want to console log the server config and also the client config, which is exactly the same. And then I also want to display the public environment. Right, this one I don't need yet. As you can see, the client's component, the console log is logged in our console, where the server config is undefined. However, the client config is ABC. Server config meaning the one without next public. Right? We can also see that the console log is also happening in our NextJS server. Right, so it happens as intended. Now, let's do a little bit more thing by trying to put in this envar in our p tag in the client component. We load, and now when you first F5 and load it, you see the DEF there, right? But immediately it disappears and then it shows up error. So this is what we call as a hydration error, because the component that client returns, it overwrites the original server components that is returned by the server, and then it realizes that both components are different, so it throws an error telling you that there's something wrong with your code, your client component. So how to solve it? Just make sure that your client component doesn't attempt to do the server side thingy. Right. As long as you don't have this, then you'll be safe. right? So that clearly means that your client component can never access the environment coming out from your server config. Okay, so that's the second point. Well, how about if we have another server component, right? So here I just say, for example, okay, so this is a server component that I log the server and also the client config only, and then it's called server component inside client, and then inside here I basically log down every single thing, right, together with the text. Okay, so from our client component, how if we put something like this, right? So here I don't want. So a server component inside client, we straight away or put this component inside, directly inside the client component. Then we reload and see. Well, we see the server component inside client, and then we see def abc hello. Hello is the text that I'm putting in, and we can see that environment variable and next public environment variable are both exists in the text that we are rendering, meaning that this server component inside client can access to the environment, the sensitive environment variables. The server component, server config, and also the client config, the console log will not be logged in the console because we have this thing. Let me check if this is here. Okay, so a server component inside the client, it is not supposed to be able to access. Okay, right. So the thing here, probably I put it this way lah. Okay, so the server component inside client is not supposed to console log one. Okay, why? Because as we have shown just now, your page route, right? You try to console log here in the outside the component, you could not do this. There's nothing shown in the console log. However, if you put the server component directly inside the client component, then you try to log it, it will behave as if it is a client component, like it will do the console log. However, in the p text that is generating, it does able to access the def, which is the sensitive information. So why does this happen? If we look at the wording here, it mentioned that the server and also the client content are different. And in this case, NextJS chose to replace the one from the client, which is doesn't have the def one, with the one from the server component, which has the def, but it does throw warning. So if you attempt to do this, like before this, you have probably messed up the structure of the server component and client component. It's very easy to do these mistakes because it feels natural, like usually like React, like anytime you want a component, just plug it in and then it works out of the box. But in this case, right, it is actually, I wouldn't say this as a, like if you use like this, I wouldn't say this is a server component. I would say this is a client component, but it is a faulty one. So how do we solve this? Right, in NextJS, there's a very important concept called composition, where we pass component as a children. If we want a server component, there's only one way, inside the client component, there's only one way that we can do this, which is using a composition design pattern. I call this a design pattern, okay? So a client component here, it will be wrapping our server component inside. So here I don't want this. So we can then put in the server component inside client, and text is equal to hi there. So we put like this as a composition structure, and then we reload it. Now we can see that now no more console log from the server component inside client. So again, this is the only way you can do if you want to wrap your server component inside a client component. The other way is you just make this fully client side, so you don't see any warnings. So if a NextJS complains to you about certain warning, do not ignore it. Yeah, try to find where is the hydration error comes from. Okay, so we have the server side server component inside client now, and it is a proper server component, which means that now we can see the server component log exactly what we wanted. We can also access the environment variable and the sensitive data directly in our server component. Okay, so that wraps up the generally how we can do the environment in both client and so server components. In the NextJS 13 onwards, there's also another very important concept called route, like route handling. So essentially, it is just a GET request. You can serve the HTTP like the server APIs inside any route.ts file, and then it will allow you to do a CRUD features and all this, right? So for example, I have this called a GET request, and then it will get server side config. Sorry, this one not needed yet. Okay, let's put it this way, and then it will return the data to our server. This GET request, right, is for preparations to be called by, I think it's callable by both client side and also server side, because it's just an endpoint actually. Like for example, if this is the route.ts is falling directly inside the API folder, so if we put it localhost 3000 and then put in the API, then we can see the data, right, first and second. So it also has access to the environment variables. Okay, so any API route can also access both sensitive and public environment variables. Right. With that being said, one last thing that I'm going to do for the .env is that let's have a look at how the server component can call the API route to render the sensitive information or whatever thing coming from the API route on our UI. Right, so just now I've put in the server component inside. So essentially this become the server component right here. Okay. In our server component, what I'm doing here is that, okay, all these don't need also. I will use I'll make this become an async component, right? So one very interesting thing about the server component is that it can be asynchronous, and you can do the API call or await anytime when you're doing the rendering, right? And then also another thing is NextJS 13. If you do like this using the app folder, you cannot use the get server side props already. But essentially, you don't need that also. Yeah, you can straight away use the this fetch method coming from the NextJS that overrides the implementation of how the fetch works and make it supporting the server side fetching data, right? So a lot of concepts, but let's forget about all these things first and focus on the environment, right? So what I'm doing here is that I'm calling the localhost 3000/API to get the data, and I do not want to catch any data. By default also, when it is a GET request, then your NextJS application will attempt to catch the API response. So you do not want to catch it. If you don't want to catch it, you need to explicitly tell it to not to catch it. And then after I get the data, I convert it to the string and then display it on the screen. So it become like this, right? In your actual application, you probably want to do something like this as well. To handle I think the concept is always like the same. Whatever things that is sensitive, you want to do in the server side, and you want to make sure that these operations are not exposed at all in any code that is returned to the client, so they can never access them. What they can access is the information that's public or that's derived from sensitive information to make it become a public information that they can see. So essentially, this is the golden rule. Right. Finally, before I end today's video, Let's also talk a bit about how we can use the legacyware, which I do not recommend at all, because as NextJS grows, you don't know how long they will support all these legacy features. Okay, so next config, you can put in the server runtime config and also public runtime config. And the way of how it works is also the same as the one that I've shared on the .env. But to access it, you can use the commanded way. Import a get config from next/config package, and then use the server runtime config and also the public runtime config. For example, in this server component, I can do like this to log my data into our console log. Right, reload it once, and then put inside here. You can see that I'm now reading from the config file. The secret and public are both visible from our server. Well, and if you attempt to access, like for example, the config from a client component, let's have a look at what it does. Right, config, and then we make it this way to become a client component. If we do like this, we can see that the config is undefined, meaning the logic or the concept is still the same. If it is coming out from the get config is generally just not accessible from our client component side, including our public runtime information. Right, so this is probably I think in the past, right, when we want to access the public runtime configuration, we should be able to access it from the client component one, like using the server-side props. But when I try, then because I cannot use the get server-side props function already, so my client component can actually never able to access the public runtime configuration, which is not a good thing, I guess, if you are using the legacy way, because you can now only access it from the server side. Yep, you can never access the config already. And if we refer to the official documentation, we scroll down to here, you can also see that it's actually using the server component one, like this one is a server component, to access the public runtime config. Although it's available in both server side and client side. So it's kind of strange. Well, you can definitely explore further. Yeah, there's this node as well. A page that relies on the public runtime config must use a get initial props or get server side props, and it must have you must have a custom app with a get initial props to opt out from the automatic static optimization, which means that like a runtime configuration won't be available or any component without being server side rendered. It has to be a server side rendered components in order to access the configurations. So either way, it's up to you to choose which environment, which way of you want to interact with the environment variables. But definitely, I 100% suggest you to go for the .env way, because it's much predictable and then up to date, also much easier to use. That's all for my sharing today. Hope you can take out with some additional information about NextJS, and we'll see you next time. See ya.